But he brought up this shooting. I thought it was interesting because he left out one of the most important parts. He brought up that he never wants to see one of these shootings happen again, but he left out how the shooter got his gun. And the shooter got his gun from his stepmother, and it was a retired service weapon that was not kept in a safe way. He stole the gun, retired service weapon, from his mother, and then he went to Florida State University and murdered 2 people and wounded 6 others.
The fluorescent lights of the House committee room cast harsh shadows across the mahogany table where 17 representatives sat in judgment of H.R. 2255. Outside Washington's April rain drummed against bulletproof windows, a percussion that seemed almost prophetic given the day's agenda. The Gun Safety Reform Subcommittee had convened to debate a bill that would allow law enforcement agencies to sell retired service weapons back to officers without background checks, without storage requirements, without the bureaucratic red tape that supporters argued hindered good cops from protecting themselves and their families. H.R. 2255 had emerged from the labyrinthine machinery of American politics with the inexorable force of legislation backed by the right interests. The National Rifle Association had spent 18 months cultivating support, channeling $2.3 million through various PACs to ensure the bill's passage. Police unions had endorsed it unanimously. The Fraternal Order of Police called it long overdue recognition of our members' service. Even some moderate Democrats found themselves nodding along who could oppose supporting law enforcement. The bill's origins traced back to a think tank white paper published by the Heritage Foundation 2 years prior, arguing that retired officers represented an untapped reservoir of trained defensive capability. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. These were people who had already been vetted, trained, trusted with weapons in service to the public. Why burden them with civilian restrictions when they retired? But buried in the bill's subsections lay provisions that would have made its original authors uncomfortable. No mandatory training refreshers, no psychological evaluations, no requirements for secure storage, no tracking of weapons after sale. The bill that began as supporting our heroes had evolved into something that looked more like deregulation with a flag draped over it. At 2:43 p.m., Representative Randy Fine of Florida's 15th District leaned into his microphone. The camera caught the glint of his American flag pin, the careful positioning of his hands, every gesture rehearsed for maximum impact. Fine had built his political career on moments like these, transforming tragedy into legislative momentum with the precision of a master craftsman. Fine's political biography read like a study in opportunistic timing. Elected in 2020 on a platform of common sense conservatism, he had quickly established himself as the Republican Party's go-to speaker for gun rights legislation. His office walls displayed photos with NRA executives, Fraternal Order of Police leadership, and the grieving families of police officers killed in the line of duty. Fine understood viscerally that in American politics, the person who could most effectively weaponize tragedy usually won. His district encompassed some of Florida's most conservative counties, where gun ownership wasn't just a right, but an identity. Fine's constituents didn't see guns as problems to be solved, but as solutions to problems created by insufficient guns. In their worldview, every mass shooting was evidence not of too many weapons, but of too few good guys carrying them. Fine's voice carried the weight of practiced grief as he began his testimony. April, 17th, 2024. 11:56 a.m. 4 minutes. The numbers dropped into the committee room silence like stones into still water, each one creating expanding ripples of attention. The story Fine told had been refined through multiple tellings at town halls on cable news in fundraising emails that had generated $47,000 for his re-election campaign. The Florida State University campus? Spring semester in full swing. Roberto Morales and Thaw Williams, two young men walking to their economics class when gunfire erupted from the library steps. Fine painted the scene with devastating efficiency, his words conjuring images that the security cameras had captured but that most committee members had never seen. Roberto, the pre-med student who tutored kids in his spare time, took the first bullet while pushing another student behind a concrete planter. The engineering major, who sent half his work-study paycheck home to his grandmother in Jacksonville, lived for 97 seconds after being shot long enough for paramedics to hear him whisper his grandmother's phone number. 6 others wounded. Sarah Chin, a sophomore from Tampa, spent 3 months learning to walk again after bullets shattered her pelvis. Marcus Rivera, a graduate student in psychology, still woke up screaming a cruel irony that Fine didn't mention but that hung in the room's air like smoke. The shooter had fired 37 rounds from a semi-automatic pistol in exactly 4 minutes and 7 seconds before campus police arrived to find him reloading. The narrative unfolded with devastating efficiency, each detail carefully chosen for maximum emotional impact while avoiding the complications that might muddy Fine's argument. He described the vigils, the families destroyed the campus that would never feel safe again, parents who no longer felt comfortable sending their children to college, students who changed majors to avoid buildings with too few exits. And then came the pivot that every seasoned political observer could see coming, but that still landed with devastating force. Fine's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber as he built toward his crescendo. If just one person, one faculty member, one security guard, one good citizen had been armed that day, Roberto and Thaw might still be with us. The logic seemed airtight, wrapped in the unassailable armor of dead children and grieving mothers. H.R. 2255 wasn't about politics. It was about ensuring that America's finest had the tools they needed to protect themselves and their communities when they retired. Who could argue against honoring the fallen by empowering the protectors? In the gallery behind the representatives, the reactions varied along predictable lines. Police officers in dress uniforms nodded grimly. Gun rights advocates leaned forward, recognizing the skill with which Fine was constructing his argument. A few family members of shooting victims shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing something familiar yet wrong in the way their loved ones' deaths were being deployed. The committee members themselves presented a tableau of calculated responses. Republicans wore expressions of solemn agreement, having heard variations of this argument countless times. Democrats looked down at their notes preparing counter-arguments about background checks and assault weapons bans, the familiar choreography of American gun politics playing out once again. As Fine settled back into his chair, the satisfaction of a well-delivered monologue evident in his posture, few in the room noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. In the back row, Representative Maxwell Frost of Florida's 10th District had been taking notes throughout Fine's speech, his pen moving with the methodical precision of someone who had learned the hard way that the devil lived not just in details, but in omissions. At 26, Frost was the youngest member of Congress, a fact that his colleagues never let him forget. They called him idealistic naive, a social media politician who confused activism with governance. The Republican caucus had dubbed him TikTok Boy for his use of social media to communicate directly with constituents. Cable news bookers loved him for his youth and passion, but often treated him as a novelty rather than a serious legislator. What they didn't know, what Fine in particular had never bothered to learn, was that Frost carried his own relationship with gun violence forged in the crucible of an event that had shaped his worldview as profoundly as Fine's district shaped his. June 12, 2016, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Frost had been 23 celebrating Pride Month with friends when Omar Mateen opened fire with a semi-automatic rifle and pistol, killing 49 people and wounding 53 others. Frost had survived by hiding in a bathroom stall for 3 hours, listening to gunshots and screams, holding his phone with a dying battery as he texted what he thought might be his final messages to his family. He had emerged into a world where the sound of fireworks made him flinch, where crowded spaces felt like traps, where the phrase thoughts and prayers had curdled into something that tasted like betrayal. In the years since Frost had watched politicians use Pulse the same way Fine was now using FSU as rhetorical ammunition in debates that never seemed to prevent the next shooting. He had seen his friends' deaths cited in support of policies that would have made their murders more likely, not less. He had learned to recognize the particular cruelty of those who use the dead to justify creating more dead. That experience had taught him something that his older colleagues often lacked the ability to hear what wasn't being said, to notice the gaps in narratives that seemed complete, to ask the questions that everyone assumed someone else had already asked. The committee chairman, Representative William Morrison of Ohio, was a tired-looking man who had presided over more of these hearings than he cared to count. Morrison had been in Congress for 14 years, long enough to recognize the rhythms of these debates. Republicans would cite defensive gun uses and constitutional rights. Democrats would cite statistics and international comparisons. The votes had usually been counted before anyone said a word. But something in Frost's posture suggested that today might be different. Morrison had learned to read the signs the way certain members prepared for moments that would define careers, the energy that crackled through the room when conventional wisdom was about to be challenged. Morrison nodded toward Fine in acknowledgement of his testimony, then turned to Frost. The chair now recognizes Representative Frost for 5 minutes. Frost stood slowly, his movement deliberate rather than eager. The camera caught something in his expression, not anger exactly, but the cold focus of someone who had been waiting for this moment. He carried a folder thick with documents, the kind of preparation that suggested this wasn't a spontaneous response, but a carefully planned intervention. He began by acknowledging Fine's eloquent tribute, agreeing that Roberto Morales and Tha Williams' lives had mattered, that their deaths were tragic, that their families deserved better than what had happened to them. The committee members relaxed slightly, expecting the familiar pattern of competitive mourning that characterized most gun debates. But then Frost did something unexpected. Instead of launching into statistics about gun violence or proposals for universal background checks, he began to tell a different story about the same tragedy. The FBI's investigative report was public record, he explained to the room with the calm authority of someone who had done his homework. FBI document 2024 FSU 4471, filed on June 15, 2024. The weapon was a Glock 22 .40 caliber pistol standard issue for the Tallahassee Police Department until their department-wide switch to Glock 17s in 2019. Serial number traced back through the ATF's database to its original purchase by the Tallahassee Police Department in 2015. The shooter, Marcus Riley, was 19 years old with no legal pathway to firearm ownership, too young under federal law to purchase a handgun from a licensed dealer. Failed background check when attempting to buy a rifle at a Tallahassee sporting goods store 6 months earlier due to a domestic violence conviction in juvenile court that had been sealed but not expunged. So where had he gotten the gun that killed Roberto and Tha? Frost moved closer to the witness table as he revealed the answer that Fine had somehow omitted from his moving tribute. Marcus Riley had stolen it from his stepmother's bedroom closet, where it had been stored loaded in an unlocked bedside drawer. Sandra Riley, Tallahassee Police Department badge number 2847, 16 years of service before retiring in 2022 with commendations for community policing and youth outreach. The room's energy shifted palpably as Frost laid out the facts with clinical precision. Officer Riley had purchased the Glock through the department's equipment buyback program, a pilot version of exactly the kind of system that H.R. 2255 would mandate nationwide. No background check required because she was law enforcement. No storage requirements because department policy assumed retired officers would maintain professional standards. No periodic verification that the weapon remained secure because that would have been considered an invasion of privacy. Marcus Riley had known where his stepmother kept the gun because she'd never been required to secure it according to any standard beyond her own judgment. He'd known how to use it because she taught him to shoot at the department's range, believing that firearms education was the best way to prevent accidents. And when he'd decided to kill his classmates, he'd had access to a weapon that had been sold to a trusted officer through exactly the kind of streamlined process that H.R. 2255 promised to expand. The irony was so perfect, it seemed scripted. The weapon that Fine was using to justify the bill was exactly the type of weapon the bill would put into circulation. As Frost spoke, the committee room's acoustics seemed to change. The usual background noise, shuffling papers, muffled conversations, the hum of recording equipment faded into silence. Even the protesters in the hallway who had been chanting slogans about gun rights and public safety seemed to have gone quiet. Fine leaned forward in his chair, his face flushed with something between embarrassment and anger. His staff seated in the row behind him exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't the direction they had expected the hearing to take. One of them was already typing furiously on a phone, presumably alerting media contacts that damage control might be necessary. The other Republicans on the committee shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Representative Sarah Kelman of Texas studied her notes intently as if they might contain an escape route from the logical trap that Frost was constructing. Representative Mike Davidson of Arizona cleaned his glasses with unusual dedication, perhaps hoping that clarity of vision might reveal a path forward that didn't involve acknowledging the contradictions in their position. The Democrats, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence. They had prepared for the usual debate about assault weapons and magazine capacities, about mental health resources and universal background checks. They hadn't expected one of their own to essentially argue that a Republican bill was wrong, using the Republicans' own example turned inside out and weaponized against them. Representative Lisa Chin of California, no relation to the wounded student, found herself reconsidering talking points that suddenly seemed inadequate. The usual Democratic response to gun violence relied on arguing for more restrictions, more regulations, more barriers to access. But Frost was making a different argument, that the barriers Republicans wanted to remove were exactly what prevented tragedies like FSU. In the gallery, reactions varied along less predictable lines. Some police officers maintained their stoic expressions, but others looked troubled as they processed the implications of what Frost was revealing. If service weapons were being stolen and used in mass shootings, what did that say about their own retirement plans, their own family's safety? Gun rights advocates faced a more complex calculation. Their movement depended on the argument that more guns in the hands of good people made everyone safer. But if good people couldn't keep their guns away from bad people, the entire logical framework started to collapse. The committee chairman reminded Fine that Frost's time had not expired, though Fine hadn't actually tried to interrupt. He had simply sat there, his mouth slightly open, as the foundation of his argument crumbled beneath him. Frost turned to face Fine directly, and for a moment the camera captured something that looked almost like pity in the younger man's eyes. Here was a man who had built his career on exploiting tragedy, only to discover that he had been unknowingly advocating for the very policies that created the tragedies he exploited. "You knew." The two words hung in the air like an indictment. They weren't a question, but a statement delivered with the quiet certainty of someone who had checked his facts. Fine's mouth opened, then closed. The calculation was visible on his face, how to respond without making things worse, how to salvage a position that had become untenable. But Frost didn't wait for an answer. He pulled additional documents from his briefcase and laid them before the committee, transforming the hearing from political theater into something resembling a courtroom cross-examination. The data painted a picture that no one in the room wanted to acknowledge. Every year, approximately 380,000 firearms were stolen from private owners in America, according to Bureau of Justice statistics reports that Frost cited chapter and verse. 1/3 of mass shooters obtain their weapons through theft, rather than purchase, a statistic that the gun lobby worked hard to minimize in public discourse. H.R. 2255 would add thousands more service weapons to that vulnerable pool, weapons sold without background checks, stored without federal requirements, tracked without ongoing oversight. States that had implemented similar programs over the past decade showed a clear pattern. Stolen police firearms were used in 23% more violent crimes than comparable civilian weapons, because criminals understood that they were reliable, well-maintained, and often loaded with hollow-point ammunition designed for maximum lethality. The committee members absorbed this information with varying degrees of discomfort. Some had genuinely believed they were supporting a pro-police bill that would honor law enforcement while enhancing public safety. Others had known the statistics, but had chosen to ignore them in favor of political expediency. A few seemed to be learning the details of the bill they were supposed to vote on for the first time. Fine. Found his voice at last, tried to speak of isolated incidents and responsible officers, but his words sounded hollow against the weight of what Frost had revealed. The talking points that had served him so well in other contexts, statistical outliers, correlation versus causation. The overwhelming majority of law-abiding citizens seemed inadequate when confronted with the mathematical certainty that some weapons would be stolen and some stolen weapons would be used to kill. The weapon that killed them is the policy you're pushing. Another silence, heavier this time. The kind that preceded revelations that would be remembered long after the specific details faded. In the gallery, family members of shooting victims leaned forward, perhaps recognizing something familiar in the way their grief was being acknowledged rather than exploited. Frost's voice dropped to barely audible as he delivered what felt like a final judgment. That's not honor. That's exploitation. The committee room had never been quieter. Even the court reporters seemed to have stopped breathing, their fingers frozen above keyboards as they processed what they had just witnessed. Fine slumped in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporated like morning mist. The American flag pin that had caught the camera's attention at the beginning of the hearing now seemed like a costume piece, a prop in a performance that had been exposed as hollow. The other Republicans on the committee stared at their notes, their phones, anything except the cameras that were capturing their expressions for posterity. They had walked into what they thought was a routine hearing about supporting law enforcement, and found themselves on the wrong side of a moral equation that admitted no comfortable resolution. The Democrats sat motionless, perhaps realizing that their usual responses, more studies, more background checks, more thoughts and prayers, seemed inadequate in the face of such systematic irony. How do you argue for more gun control when the problem is that existing gun control measures are being systematically undermined by the very people who are supposed to enforce them? The facts spoke for themselves louder than any speech, more damning than any accusation. The machinery of democracy had become so focused on political efficiency that it had lost track of moral purpose. The tools created to protect had become the weapons that destroyed, and the difference between safety and danger lay not in intentions, but in the willingness to see clearly what was actually being created. In that moment of perfect silence, the true cost of American gun politics became visible, not just the bodies that accumulated with each shooting, but the moral corruption that occurred when tragedy became currency, when dead children became talking points, when grief became a resource to be mined for political advantage. The rain outside continued its steady percussion against the bulletproof windows, a sound that seemed almost mocking now. The committee would recess, reconvene, and ultimately vote to pass H.R. 2255 by exactly the margin that everyone had predicted before Frost had said a word. The political arithmetic was unchanged by moral revelation. But something else had shifted in that room, an intangible but unmistakable recognition that certainty had cracks, that good intentions weren't enough, that the distance between helping and harming could be measured in details that everyone had assumed were someone else's responsibility. Hours later, when the committee reconvened after what the chairman diplomatically called a brief recess to review the testimony, H.R. 2255 passed by a vote of 11-6, exactly as Frost had predicted. The political arithmetic was unchanged. The lobbyist investment was protected. The police union's endorsement was honored. The machinery of American politics ground forward with its usual inexorable momentum. But in the final moments before the vote, Fine rose one last time. His voice was quieter now, less certain, stripped of the righteous confidence that had characterized his opening statement. He spoke of still believing in H.R. 2255, of continuing to support law enforcement, but acknowledged that important questions had been raised about implementation, about safeguards, about making sure they were solving the right problem rather than creating new ones. It wasn't an apology exactly. Politicians rarely apologize, especially not to junior colleagues who had just publicly demolished their signature legislation. But it was something an acknowledgement that the machinery of good intentions could produce devastating results when operated by those who refused to see clearly what they were actually building. As the committee members filed out into the hallway, Frost gathered his papers slowly, methodically, returning each document to its proper folder. A few colleagues approached him, some to congratulate, others to commiserate, a few simply to ask how he had known to look for the connection between the FSU shooter and H.R. 2255. He deflected most questions with a tired smile, but to the last one, he had a real answer that revealed something about how democracy might still function even in a system designed to obscure truth rather than reveal it. I didn't look for a connection. I looked for the truth. The hallway gradually emptied, leaving only the institutional sounds of democracy, the hum of fluorescent lights, the whisper of climate control, the distant chatter of lobbyists and staffers planning tomorrow's battles. In a few hours, the news cycle would move on. Other tragedies would demand attention. Other bills would require votes. Other politicians would find new ways to exploit old grief. But in that moment, in that place where laws were made and futures decided, a simple truth had been spoken, that those who wrapped themselves in tragedy while creating the conditions for more tragedy could be called to account even in a system designed to obscure such accountability. H.R. 2255 would become law within 6 months, signed in a rose garden ceremony surrounded by police officers and their families. The president would speak of honoring those who served, of supporting those who protected and served. The weapons would flow into circulation, thousands of them, sold without checks, stored without requirements, tracked without oversight. And when the inevitable happened, when stolen service weapons began appearing at crime scenes with increasing frequency, there would be other hearings, other speeches, other opportunities for politicians to exploit tragedy while creating the conditions for more tragedy. But there would also be a record of this day, this moment, this choice. A reminder that somewhere, once the truth had been spoken plainly in a room where it mattered. A testament to the possibility that democracy, for all its flaws, still contained within itself the capacity for honesty, even when that honesty was uncomfortable, inconvenient, and utterly devastating to cherished assumptions. The 4 minutes that destroyed Roberto Morales and Tha Williams had become something else, a moment of moral clarity in a system designed to obscure such clarity. Not redemption, perhaps, but recognition. Not justice, but truth. In the end, that had to be enough.